91.3 KXCI Tucson. This is Aspen Green, and I'm here with Kathy Harris for Broad Perspectives. Boy, am I excited about today's show. So we have with us Ianthe McGuinn, and she was born Dolores in Ray, Arizona in 1942. She changed her name to Ianthe as a follower of Subud, which is an Indonesian practice. After spending a childhood with her resilient and hardworking mother, who's profiled in songs My Mother Sang to Me, an oral history by Patricia Martin, Ianthe became involved with the 1960s folk music scene in Hollywood, California. During this experience, she met and later married Roger, at that time was known as Jim McGuinn, who was on the threshold of fame and success as the founding member of his rock music group, The Byrds. After divorce and raising two young sons as a single mom, Ianthe later remarried and completed a nursing degree in her hometown of Tucson, where she currently writes stories and poetry. She wrote a book about her life with Roger-McGuinn and the Byrds called In the Wings. It is such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, it's nice being here. Thank you.
You know, I read your book. It was just a wonderful experience to go back in that world and to hear all the amazing things that you did and were around. But, you know, you were here and you were going to high school here, and you wanted to have a career in journalism when you were in high school, and you actually became the editor of your high school newspaper, El Guerrero. Did you move to L.A. to pursue a career in journalism?
I thought I could. I went into Los Angeles and started attending Los Angeles College. And, of course, you know, the minute I walked into the English class, the instructor said, 40% of you are going to drop out. So, I mean, that was very encouraging. But I continued. I mean, I was always writing, and at that point really didn't know what I wanted to do. It was such an exciting city.
You were kind of an early feminist, weren't you?
Definitely. I think that I was pretty independent at that time, and I'd like to think I was an early feminist.
By reading your book, I'm going to say you were. You know, you've been silent for over 40 years, and then you wanted to tell your story. What made you want to write the book In the Wings about your life with Roger-McGuinn?
So many people ask me about that time meeting the Beatles and Rolling Stones, and everything was so clear in my mind. And, you know, I have two grandsons, James and Kieran, and James one day said, Nana, I want you to tell me about the Byrds and the 60s, and don't leave anything out.
You know, you definitely don't go with the saying, if you remember the 60s, you weren't there, because you were there and you remember a lot. How long did it take you to complete the book?
I think basically sitting down and doing it, it was probably about 2 years, you know, of intense writing.
I mean, you did really remember so much detail, names of people, places, restaurants, gigs, cities. In writing this book, I have to wonder, was it therapeutic or cathartic? And did you leave anything out?
I left a lot out.
Okay, that's what we want to hear about.
But did you feel like it was a real cathartic thing for you?
It was. You know, there were some very tragic episodes and things that I had always actually tried to forget, but they came back crystal clear.
Well, you were a young, beautiful Mexican-American girl, and now you're a beautiful
old lady.
Beautiful old. You're not an old lady. And you wrote that you thought L.A. was a big city that ignored one's ethnic background. Did that turn out to be true?
In a sense, because, you know, no one ever paid attention to you, really. And as long as you had the background, you could get a job. I went to one of the newspapers to try to get a job, and they put me in the phone subscription. So I'm like, well, this isn't what I want. Really.
Well, you ended up right in this epicenter of the 60s rock history. but almost by chance. I didn't get the impression you were a groupie following bands around. It seemed like you just ended up in the right place at the right time. You were working at the AshGrove Coffee House. Tell us about the AshGrove Coffee House.
The AshGrove was really the epicenter for traditional folk music. The owner always had, different people like blind Reverend Gary Davis, Lightning Hopkins. They were all traditional folk musicians. So it was really an active place. And they were always mulling around, doing hootenannies, or he had seminars for teaching kids how to play banjo, mandolin, guitar, whatever.
And this was going on at the same time that the Troubadour was happening, right? Am I correct?
Exactly. And they were considered more commercial folk musicians, like the new Christy Minstrels. And although Roger and Gene Clark met there at the Troubadour.
Okay. So you seem to be just going about your life, working and dating, and you met Roger-McGuinn. How did you meet him, and what was he doing at the time?
He and a friend had come in to see some young women who had beautiful harmonies. I think they were Kathy and Carol. And he came in with Chris Hillman, and they were sitting there, and somehow the stage light hit his profile, and there was this beautiful glowing halo around his blonde hair, and I just fell in love instantly.
I was kind of amazed at the what I call chutzpah on how you actually met him, because you went to his place, didn't you?
I know. I guess it took a lot of brave gall to go up there. But, I was a wild kid at the time, so I was going to go find the love of my life.
Hey, a man with a halo, who can resist that?
Absolutely. So you've met Bob Dylan, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Marlon Brando, Peter Fonda, Harrison Ford, Mama Cass, Grace Slick, and I'm not even naming nearly close to all of them. But I'm curious, who made a big impression on you?
Well, it would have been Marlon Brando, really. Him and, it was fun meeting the Beatles. They were exciting, and Dylan, he was just so special. He definitely was a character at that time.
Yeah, that leads me to my next little quote here. It's "Are you coming with me or are you staying with him?" Marlon Brando asked a 22-year-old woman he dubbed the girl of my dreams, who happened to be you. What was going on in your mind, and why didn't you go with him?
That's a good question.
You're wondering now why.
Oh, dear. Well, I was in love. I really didn't want to desert Roger. You're supposed to go home with the guy you came in with, right? And even though it was very tempting, and I'd seen Brando, as a matter of fact, Roger speaks about it in one of his interviews, that he says that, I saw my girlfriend talking to Brando or something or another.
As the only female and Mexican-American among a group of young men on the brink of stardom, the Byrds, what was it like for you? Were the guys in the band accepting of you? Did you feel comfortable being around everyone?
They were really sweet. I think that Michael was always sort of teasing me, or, Chris and David, they were more serious. And Gene, he was sort of a person unto himself. He was polite. They were all gentlemen.
And one more thing I want to discuss about these famous people. It was kind of funny to read that you were renovating your house at one point. And am I correct that Harrison Ford was the person in charge of renovating your house?
Yes.
All right. How did that come about?
There was certain things that were going on with the house that I felt needed to be done, And Peter Fonda said he had this friend who was from Chicago and was a part-time actor, but he'd taken up carpentry. And so he brought him over one afternoon. It was a young Harrison Ford, really handsome, beautiful guy, but he tore apart my kitchen, and I think along with it, my marriage.
Yeah, that was kind of during a tough time for you. You know, I know you've been asked this, and people ask why you didn't write more about the Byrds' music. Could you tell us why you didn't?
There have been quite a few books written, and especially Johnny Rogan. He wrote Timeless Flight. It's really like a 3-inch Byrds Bible. It has everything, discography, and it just, even I think some of the gigs are in there. But, I thought that had been gone over pretty much by him.
You did mention that you had a good story you wanted to tell us about Jimi Hendrix. I mean, who doesn't want to hear a story about Jimi Hendrix?
It's interesting. This must have happened about 67, actually probably just after the Monterey Pop Festival. The Byrds were playing at Whiskey A Go-Go, and it was a pretty big crowd, but anyway, the set broke and they went up to their dressing room, which is upstairs. And as I was walking up, there's like a little crow's nest place where the kids used to sit that were under 21. And who was sitting there but Jimi Hendrix, all by himself. I couldn't believe it, And I walked up to him and I'm like, "What's going on?" And he says, "Oh, I'm just listening." And I said, "Why don't you come backstage where the guys are?" And so I took him backstage, and they're all happy to see him. But it was just so strange to see him all by himself.
Was he famous at that time?
Yes, it was after the pop festival. Maybe not as famous as he should have been because they were recording in England.
You did go to the Monterey Pop Festival. It's funny, I just watched that movie presented by The Loft. What was it like being at the Monterey Pop Festival?
It was really interesting because there were so many degrees of excitement with each of these groups. I mean, there was a Who, they were like smashing their guitars, and it was just sort of turning where the groups were becoming more psychedelic with their garb.
Janis Joplin.
Oh gosh, she was great. She was a sweet, gentle person. I say this in the book. Grace and Janis were women that had to deal with men, and so they could be pretty tough when it came down to it and really speak their mind, They didn't take any gup from anyone.
So you were married to Roger-McGuinn, and you had 2 children with him. What was it like being married to the leader of the Byrds?
Well, it was really exciting. We traveled a lot in the early days, and I was always tagging around. That was really exciting. And I'll treasure that, actually.
Unfortunately, that marriage didn't last. How was your love destroyed, and how did you just survive after that?
Well, I don't know that it was actually destroyed. I still love him somewhere in my heart. But it was, deception in a marriage is hard to cope with, and
living in that fast lane, I'm sure there was a lot of things that happened where people were influenced by other people.
Well, I'm surprised the marriage survived as long as it did because we were together from late 64 to 71, so it was strange.
Yeah. There's so much more to this book. It's jam-packed with people, places, and things. Where can people buy your book? Because I think it's a must-read.
You can order it on Amazon. It's New Haven Publishing. It's an English publishing company.
Quickly, Patrick and Henry, your 2 sons. One's a musician and one's a successful movie maker, correct?
Well, I'm pretty happy for them. I'm happy for myself that they're there.
Well, we're happy for you, too. And you know what? I think we're very grateful to your grandson for saying, Nana, I want to know everything, every story. Don't leave anything out.
Absolutely. Because of him, we get to know all this rich information, and a lot of it is really fun.
Yeah, it's. I just started reading the book myself. I got it from Aspen, and it's. I can't wait to read the rest of it. It really catches your attention.
Oh, thank you, Kathy.
Are we out of time?
We are out of time. I'm sorry, but Ianthe, thank you so much, and thank you for this delightful book. I don't know if you even realize how much the rest of us appreciate hearing about our idols like this. Since you were living it,
thank
it probably is hard for you to understand that, but we really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And thanks to our audience out there for listening today, too. And please listen every Sunday at 3 o'clock to Broad Perspectives Radio, a program by women, about women, but for everyone.